Hi, everybody. It's Dale Walsh, the Poetic Warrior, and welcoming you to Straight, Sane, and Sober for another episode on Tuesday. And I hope everybody's doing well. And just, I'm very happy to have as our guest today Dr. Donald Skip Mondragon. Is that correct, Skip?
That's
Mo-
great.
Mondragon. And I'm looking for the video to. Oh, here we go. Okay, so we're just we're going to have a big discussion. Doctor Skip was a 26-year Army veteran, and we're going to talk about his experiences, and also he's written a book on depression, and he did suffer from depression, and so we're going just to explore the whole journey he's been on, and it's going to be fascinating. So let me do this, and then we'll come back. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for attending today. And I have a couple of announcements before we get into into the meat of the show. But as you know, as being the poetic warrior, I also always start the show with a poem, and this one is called "I Am Only a Poet," and it's from my collection available on Amazon called "For Those Who Hate Verse," and so you can always find me at Amazon and go to Poetry Book by D.E. Walsh, and it should come up. You might have to scroll a little bit to find it, but this is called I Am Only a Poet, and it goes like this. Only a poet can compose in words a portrait of the beauty you create by your presence in the world. Only a poet can immortalize the bounty of your goodness you represent by the bliss of your body. Only a poet can capture in verse the sacred grace you exude through the magic of the air. Only a poet can rhapsodize the intricacies of your cosmic dance upon the stage of universal knowing. Only a poet can cherish with passion the poetess you became by overcoming the agonies of earthly reality. Only a poet can edify the cathedral of your intensity with sentiments of longing that know no end. Only a poet can describe the essence of your perfection and mind of an audience desperate for meaning. Only a poet can compete with the Lord for the saving spirit of this planet he left in a far distant future. Only a poet can express the craving for salvation every person feels, but no other can with skill enunciate. Only a poet can love you. So that's my contribution for the week, and welcome, Doctor Skip. How are you?
I'm doing well, Dale. Doing very well. Thank you, sir.
I really want to thank you for joining us. I feel very honored to have you. Just just to give the audience a little background, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, including your army career and what you're doing now and your battles with depression? There's a lot we're going to cover. So you
Surely.
just
Well, just going a little bit farther back, I'm the third of 8 children. Grew up in Denver, Colorado, 4 years in New Mexico, but back to Colorado. I discovered wrestling as a eighth grader after being miserable. I mean, utterly miserable at any other sport. I even failed at tetherball.
I always had problems with tetherball too, to tell you the truth.
I was
I was too short, and they would like spike it, and it would be high, and
right. We're in the same camp, buddy. Remember we talked about that being the
yeah,
smallest
yeah.
kids in our class. I was bullied uh, there until the eighth grade. I discovered wrestling, and that changed my life. So I discovered wrestling in eighth grade. I didn't win a match my first 2 years, but then went on to be a two-time district champion, state runner-up, and honorable mention All-American before I graduated from high school. wrestled a couple years in college. I was a mediocre at best college wrestler, but still had the bug, would coach, competed some over the years. My four sons all wrestled. My four younger brothers all wrestled. My father-in-law was a wrestler. My brother-in-law was a wrestler. So wrestling's in my blood. In fact, my kids would call me a wrestling groupie because
Okay.
I'd make friends with national champions, world champions, Olympic champions, getting them to sign my posters, my wrestling cards, take pictures with them, take them out to eat. Yeah, wrestling's in my blood. It's taught me many life lessons, and we'll get into that a little bit more farther.
Right.
So fast forward there, I go to undergrad, graduate from Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That's where I met my sweetheart, Sherry. And this year we celebrated 41 years of marriage. Stayed there at Oral Roberts University to attend the Oral Roberts University School of Medicine, graduated in 1985, 3.5 years of residency in Canton, Ohio, and then came on active duty in January of 1989. And so spent 26 years in the Army. I was deployed a total of 37 months, over 18 months in combat zones. And as you mentioned, Dale, I suffered major depression my last year and a half in the Army. That changed the course of my life.
So did you leave the Army because of depression, or was just like collateral damage? It was.
No, I was already had set that date to retire. So my wife and I were already preparing to retire. We had already submitted papers that we knew we were going to retire at the end of 2014. But starting in 2013, there was just a perfect storm of events going on, and those things just piled one on top of another. And then unresolved trauma. You think of trauma as a child, trauma as a teen, trauma as a young adult. And then as a physician, you're dealing with trauma, death and dying. And then as a military physician, you're
Right.
taking care of mangled and dying soldiers. You're taking care of burned soldiers in some cases, and you don't deal with that trauma. And so it just gets compartmentalized and pushed aside because now you've got to go on to the next patient. Now you got to take care of your family. Now you got to do this. And so you don't process this trauma. And then that last year, starting in 2013, the summer of 2013, things just began to spiral out of control. Insomnia, these negative thoughts, what we call negative ruminations in medical terms. You don't deserve to be a colonel. You let your family down. You let your department down. You let the Army down.
Right.
Who's going to want to hire you? You're a fake. Indecision, loss of confidence. My cognition was off. I couldn't remember what I read 5 minutes before. I actually thought I was suffering from early onset dementia, that I got tested. Thankfully, the test didn't show dementia. They attributed it to stress, to the insomnia, to previous TBIs. So all of this is going on. It felt like I was going through life in black and white. I lost interest in my passions, including wrestling. No interest in coaching the boys I coached, not even watching amateur wrestling. So this is the backdrop, and this just got progressively worse with my mood sinking deeper and deeper, just more and more blue. And it's not just a sense of feeling down. It's like this heavy blanket, this dark, palpable cloud that just descends upon you.
Right.
And so all of this is going on. And then, there's physical symptoms too. The insomnia I mentioned, and aches and pains from osteoarthritis and the overuse injuries were accentuated. And then you talk about kicking a guy when he's down. My libido, my sex drive was in the toilet.
Right.
So man, it was bad. And all these symptoms just got progressively worse and worse and worse and worse, to the point on April 17th, 2014, it seemed like a normal day. I got up early, about 5:15 a.m., groomed and dressed quickly, had my devotions, and then was out the door to get to Eisenhower Army Medical Center in Augusta, Georgia. And got there early, always got there early, walked down to the empty hallway to the Department of Medicine, unlocked the office, stepped inside, turned on the lights, then everything came crashing down upon me. You know, I just had it at that point. I couldn't deal with anything more. At that point, I was beat up, beaten down, and I was broken. I locked the door behind me, turned off the lights, closed the blinds, turned off my phones, and I curled up under my desk in a fetal position on that musty carpet. And for 4 hours, I wrestled with these questions. Skip, what are you doing? Skip, how did you get here? What happened? You're a tough guy. You're a colonel. You've been in combat zones for over 18 months. You're a national wrestling champion. What happened? And now these scenes and memories are just flying back and forth, and it's becoming this participant observer. It's almost like being a patient doctor that was going on while I keep asking myself these questions. And then very slowly, I began to put those pieces together. And I could see, oh, insomnia, blue mood, loss of confidence, indecision, impaired cognition, going through life like it was black and white, not, you know, all these symptoms there. I also had withdrawal from things, the aches and pains, the loss of sex drive. So all of these things, this whole constellation of symptoms. Oh, then after 4 hours, it was like, bing, Skip, you're depressed. Go get help. And at that point, I crawled out from under that desk with a little flicker of hope. And that afternoon, I went to see a clinical psychologist to confirm the diagnosis of major depression. And that began a long, rocky road to recovery.
So this was April. So this was like about how long before you were actually discharged from the Army?
That was April of 2014. We officially retired from the Army December 31st, 2014, but we started our transition leave mid-November. Transition leave meaning we signed out, and now we had about 6 weeks before we were officially out of the Army.
Right. So how was it? I mean, obviously depression is a bitch, you know, excuse the French, but just how was it the transition? How did it like complicate your transition to civilian life? And
it really impacted that whole process, because I didn't get the application submitted for a Texas state medical license. I didn't find a new job there. We had online, my wife had looked at different houses, but we didn't make a trip out to Texas to do any house hunting. So a lot of things were in flux at that point. Plus my emotions were still very raw. And so I was in this tenuous space. Still, there was a lot of indecision, and my confidence still was not where it normally would be. And I was on medication at that time. Throughout that time, I had been on medication, had been taking, I was in therapy, seeing a clinical psychologist. So again, it was it really delayed a lot of the things we thought we were going to have done and in place when we signed out on terminal leave to make our final preparations to leave for Texas, to head to Texas. So that was the backdrop of all of this. I did want to share, though, a critical turning point, and that happened about 6 weeks into my recovery. And up to this point, for many months, my prayers had been, Lord, please deliver me from this darkness. I pleaded, I cried, I screamed those prayers, but to no avail. And one day, my brother Chris, my youngest brother, there's 5 of us, he called and he said, Skip, I just attended this Bible study with Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham. And Franklin taught about suffering and the suffering of Christ. And he challenged us. He said, why do we think we should be immune from pain if Christ suffered so brutally upon that cross for us? And I began to think about that. And over the next 2 days, the verse that kept coming to mind, the Apostle Paul wrote in the book of Philippians, chapter 2, verse 13, he wrote, oh, that I might know him, referring to Christ, and the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his suffering. I knew that verse. I had prayed that verse. I knew it well. But in the midst of my suffering, what did I want? Deliverance from my suffering. And over the course of 2 days, my prayers went from, Lord, please deliver me, to Lord, what would you have me learn? And how might I use it to help others? And that prayer changed my perspective, changed the course of my life, because at that point, I understood I was going to have to share my story. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew I must share my story. So I began to take note of the lessons I had learned and the lessons I was learning, with the intent that I was going to share things in the future. And I had that opportunity before I left Eisenhower Army Medical Center to share with the staff at Eisenhower Army Medical Center. And that was the first time I ever shared my story in a public forum.
Right. So, when you brought up Paul in the quote from Ephesians or Philippian?
Philippians.
So that made me think about Paul himself. You said someplace, I have a thorn in my side that I've asked God to take away, but he is helping me grow. And, if God wants me to have that thorn, then who am I to argue with him?
Sure. Yeah.
So when did your brother get you to change your prayer? Was that before? Or
that
after?
would have been around, let's see, so April into May. That would have been probably early June timeframe, early to mid-June.
Right. So you feel that your faith and your dedication to Christ had like a pivotal effect on your recovery, right?
No doubt about it, Dale. I talk about the importance of F3, your family, your friends, and your faith. And absolutely.
Right. So, okay. So, you got out of the Army and you weren't prepared really.
No.
So, why don't you bring us up to date about what happened after you got out of the Army?
Well, we got out of the Army. And so in early December, we arrived in Texas, in Midlothian, Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We were staying with my daughter. Our daughter is our middle child of 5. She has 2 older brothers and 2 younger brothers. And so we were staying with my daughter and my son-in-law as we house hunted. And that turned out to be a longer stay than we anticipated. So we arrived early December, and we didn't get to move into our house due to some delays until mid March or early March. I think it was second week in March, that we in 2015 that we could finally move into our house. So that, and then I was working on my Texas State medical license, and there were some delays due to some technicalities. So the Texas State medical license didn't get approved until September that year. So that was some real faux pas there.
Right.
Should have been a process that, took place in, a few months, just stretched out and out and out. And then I worked for a while with the VA, the Veterans Administration, as a locum tenens, so some temporary work with them. Actually traveled to Alabama to do that. And then I decided after several weeks, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? I've already lived apart from my house and my bed and the comforts of home for 3.5 years. So why do I want to live in this hotel, this extended stay hotel for away from my house? I don't want to do this anymore. And so told him, okay, at the end of this week, this will be my last week. I'm going back home. And then the following February, then I started at what's called the Hope Clinic in a nearby city with a federally qualified health clinic. And the role of federally qualified health clinic is to take care of the medically underserved. And I did that for 4 years. And now,
no, go ahead. Go on. I'm sorry. Go on.
And now I work part-time, as I say, working as a contractor for the Texas Department of Workmen's Compensation as what's called a designated doctor doing specialty exams.
Okay. And that brings us up to the present, right?
Yes, sir.
So one thing that sort of came into my head was, not only was the faith important, but also the dedication to service and to serving people instead of just personal agenda, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I think that's one of the things that is important. And I'm glad you brought that up, Dale, because being part of something bigger than yourself and in service. And that's one thing about the Army and that identity with the Army and that culture is you are part of something bigger than yourself. You are contributing to a greater purpose in service. And then when we left the Army, you're apart from that culture. You're apart from that support, that identity. So here I am, Colonel Mondragon, Dr. Mondragon, well known in the hospital, chief of the Department of Medicine, sitting on some of the highest committees in the hospital, well known in the hospital, well respected. And then you retire from the Army. Now you're in the community and you're Dr. Mondragon. People asking, well, where are you working? What do you do? Well, I'm waiting on my Texas State medical license. I'm not working. So now you're Joe Schmo who doesn't have a job. And so that status, and I didn't realize how much my identity was tied up as in the Army, as a colonel, as a combat vet. So that identity is kind of, well, isn't kind of, but it is stripped away from you, and that support system, that Army culture that you have, and being part of something bigger, as you said. And so that being in service to others is so important, I think, to all of us and to our well-being.
Right. Well, I sort of have a similar story with schizophrenia and not depression, but just before we get into that, Adam has a question and says, what does insomnia look like for those that have never just starting to experience it?
Well, insomnia, it started off where I'd have trouble falling asleep maybe for an hour, and then that would progress to 2 to 3 to 4 hours. And then I might be up repeatedly 6, 8 or more times a night, lay down, try to fall asleep. After 20 to 30 minutes, can't fall asleep, get up. So some nights that was the whole pattern. Other nights, maybe I'd fall asleep finally within a couple hours. Bing, I was wide awake and couldn't fall back asleep. So this was just a chronic insomnia there where I'd long for 2 to 3 hours of uninterrupted sleep. I would just, if I could just have a few hours where I could just sleep. That's how bad it was. Now, with depression, you could have insomnia where you can't sleep. You also have the early morning awakenings that we talk about. That's what I also experienced, where if you do fall asleep, you might awaken within a few hours in the early morning hours and can't fall back asleep. And then there's the other spectrum where individuals, all they want to do is sleep.
Correct.
Well, 14, 16 hours a day, they're just utterly exhausted and they just want to sleep. So the sleep disruption is one of the cardinal symptoms of depression.
All right, so now you say you couldn't get to sleep, but was that just because you couldn't turn your brain off, or it was just like, I mean, what was the origin of?
Well, it was couldn't turn the brain off, and then the worry. The more you couldn't turn the brain off, the more you worry. Gosh, I can't fall asleep. So it's this kind of pattern, this cyclical pattern. Plus, at that point, think about it, when you take away the distractions of the day, and now you have those negative thoughts assailing you that are just battering you. You've let your family down. You've let your department down. You've let the army down. You've let the hospital down. Who's going to want to hire you? You're a fake. You don't deserve to be a colonel. And yeah, I'd contend with those thoughts during the day, but I could occupy myself with other things. I had other duties that would distract me. And if I wasn't distracted, sure, those thoughts would beat me up. But at night, you take away all the distractions. You don't have the sounds, you don't have the sights, you're in the dark laying there. My wife soundly asleep next to me. And now I'm laying there and these thoughts, bam, 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 bam. And so it's all of this going on. So it's a combination of things that happen. Plus, there's a disruption in certain hormones, including the melatonin and the precursors to melatonin, that get disrupted in depression. And so it's not just the anxiety and the thoughts, but there's also some physiologic things that take place with hormonal disruptions that also impact your sleep.
Right. Well, I'm struggling with that a little bit too, because I have a lady in California that I've been corresponding with, and she usually doesn't get home till like 11 my time. So we talk, into the early morning. But I've been noticing that, I'm still, I'm going to bed very late and waking up very early for me. So, in actually last night I had like the first 6 hours sleep I've had in a long time. So, that's something that's sort of like troubling me. But I want to ask you about, like, what's the difference, or what observations did you have between like Army therapy and civilian therapy?
Oh, wow. That's a great question, Dale. I tell people that I received care from the A team, and I had a amazing clinical therapist, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Perry, fabulous man, tall, distinguished African-American man. And Mike and I hit it off from day one. A lot of commonalities. He and I were deployed, family men, Christians, very much loved our wives, and we just hit it off and worked very closely together. So I would see him weekly for first matter of months. So my clinical therapist, psychiatrist, and then my primary care physician. So I received fabulous care from these providers. But when I transitioned, it was a little rocky getting a new psychiatrist. So it took a little bit there because I went to get my care at the VA. I could have gotten civilian care, but I felt comfortable in that military environment, if you
Right.
will. So it took a little bit of time, maybe a month and a half or so, before I had a psychiatrist in the VA. And so there's a little bit of disjointed care in there before I secured that person, and then later arranged to have another therapist. But again, the care that I've received has been, again, top notch. So I've
So
had, in both sectors, I've had great care, but I especially with my therapist, and I've had some great therapists too, and I've been so grateful on both military and uh, in the civilian sector. I've received some wonderful care too.
well, that's
But
great to
yeah,
hear.
but the difference in the military, for instance, I was seeing a military therapist and I was seeing a military psychiatrist. So those commonalities, individuals who have deployed, individuals that understand the culture of the Army and the lingo of the Army. And so there are certain commonalities and camaraderie that a civilian can't understand. They've not experienced those things.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. That brings up. I know you're just bringing up questions as you talk, but just so I was in intensive therapy for 5 years in the program and everything, and I had like a doctor who saw me 3 times. It was his program. He was like God in my program. I
Mm.
thought I was God, but Doctor Bonanno was God. So, but so I'm just curious, like, how did like therapy with the psychiatrist? I mean, did you just see a psychiatrist for medication, or did you have like actual sessions with him, or because
No,
like,
no, the psychiatrist was primarily for for medication. Of course, they do screening every time I'd see them for to assess how you're doing and any suicidality, etc., and medication adjustments. And the therapist is really where the work was done. I was
right,
undergoing cognitive behavioral therapy where you're looking to retrain the mind
right.
because my confidence was shot. I was so indecisive, felt so beat up, beat down, and broken at that point that now you're literally retraining the mind. And that's the purpose of cognitive behavioral therapy, as you're well aware.
So, what lessons from wrestling have you used to fight your depression?
Well, I think the first and foremost is this idea that wrestling teaches you that life is going to knock you on your back, and wrestling teaches you how to get off your back. The other is this idea of guts, this idea that you have to reach down. There's perhaps no other sport or very few sports that are as intense and demanding as wrestling, both physically, emotionally, spiritually. The demands of wrestling are so intense, and the training is rigorous. I've
Right.
seen I've seen high school All-American athletes turned into wimps when they've tried wrestling because
So
wrestling is tough. So the demands of wrestling is so intense that that idea that I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep pushing myself. One more rep, one more push up, one more pull up, one more rinse sprint, one more takedown. You keep working hard. And so this idea that I keep pushing, and it was a determination. I am going to get better no matter what. I am going to get better. Making that decision. I remember a night sitting on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down my face next to my sweetheart, telling her, honey, it's not always going to be like this. Honey, I am going to get better. And so it's that determination, lessons of dedication, lessons of determination, lessons that this is going to be painful, but I can endure this. And you go back to the basics. You work on the basics. There are things that you have to master the basics. And wrestling, you had to learn the basics before you could build on those.
Right.
And again, there are basics in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy and basics that you had to work on. And so working on these basics to rebuild myself and my health. And those were some of the lessons, but I learned other lessons along the way, lessons that to be more grateful, lessons not to be so hard on myself. I was a very driven person, always achieve this goal and on to the next goal, and not taking time to celebrate. Being my worst critic, not learning to talk to myself more gently and kindly. And I would tell my patients, and I do tell my patients, self-care is not selfish.
Right.
But I was always giving and giving and giving and giving. And that's one of the things that got me into trouble in the first place, Dale, is over the decades, that's what I was doing, giving and giving and giving and not monitoring my own stores, my emotional stores, my physical stores, my mental stores, my spiritual stores, that social stores, that I was just so utterly depleted that I didn't monitor these things because I was always in this giving mode, give and take care of everybody else. Self-care is not selfish. So
was it
taking care of
basically?
yourself.
No,
Sir?
I was just going to ask if like what you're just saying about giving, it got to the point where you gave so much of yourself that you had nothing left to fight within you to.
There you go. Because in wrestling, you train hard, and my brother Chris and I talk about it a lot, that we overtrained. And had we known what we know now, we would have trained less and took more time to recover. And so that's a lesson learned, that you can push and push at times, but then you have to step back and recover.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I learned is step back, recover, enjoy the moment. That's something else. Enjoy the moment. Again, I was so driven and pushing so hard, I couldn't always just enjoy the moment.
Right. Well, I know this is a little off our planned agenda, but you must have gotten these drives from somewhere. So, was it your stepfather, your parents, or what do you attribute your this incredible drive to like be better and everything to?
That's a good question. Well, I think it comes probably from my little grandma, my abuelita, my maternal grandma. She stood about 4'9", maybe 90 pounds, soaking wet, spoke Spanglish, only had finished the 3rd grade before her father pulled her out of school to help around the house in their little farm, but one of the wisest women I've ever known. And the tragedies that she lived with, went through it during the course of her life. She died at the age of 93. And my little grandma, or abuelita as we call her in Spanish, abuela is grandma, ita means little, that it was this powerful resilience, faith, that she went through life and demonstrated that. And then again, my mom, this drive that she had. And so I think it was out of that. Plus, it was a very difficult childhood that I went through. And all of these things taught me resilience. And then the wrestling. Like I said, wrestling changed my life. And those lessons of resilience, those lessons of toughness that I went through. And I think part of it was also, I'm going to show you. I know that was part of it in retrospect, because I had been bullied up till the 8th grade after I started wrestling. I was a small kid. I was the new kid on the block because we moved frequently. I was shy and I was awkward socially, not just physically. I was an easy target for bullies. And with wrestling, then came this mentality. All right, I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you. Okay. And it was one of those ways I was going to show you. Academically was another way. And so it was an overcompensation. And I think that's where some of that drive also came.
Well, this happens with a lot of people, especially like people, I mean, a lot of people that I coach with and stuff. It's just like in order to build your self esteem and to to make yourself think that you're worthy, you like overachieve to the max and you just drive yourself and ultimately you have to realize that, your life isn't based upon your achievements, it's based upon your own sense of worth.
Indeed. It's not Dr. Mondragon, Colonel Mondragon, combat vet Mondragon, and on and on. It's who you are and whose you are. That
Right.
when you can begin to truly understand that, life is so much sweeter and so much easier.
Sorry. Sorry. Sorry about that. I thought I had turned my phone off, but so I definitely believe that the imposter syndrome and everything, that's like a matter of like when your overachievements don't seem to matter anymore. Because and I'd love you to talk about your book at this point.
Oh, sure. Here's the book, Wrestling Depression is Not for Wimps. And the genesis of this book was when I realized I had to share my story and began to write down those lessons I had learned and was learning. And then after I shared that first time with the staff at Eisenhower Army Medical Center, the next year I won a writing contest. And with that writing contest came a publication deal. And this book then came out of that. And I use wrestling analogies, anecdotes from my wrestling career over the years to illustrate those principles related to depression and recovery from depression, how to maintain your health and wellness. And so this is written in short, easy to read chapters, written for tough guys, written in layman's terms, and written to be put into practice today.
And that brings up the other thing that I wanted to discuss is you brought up the culture of the Army. And I mean, in civilian life, depression, people just say, well, pull yourself out of it and everything. But I think that like culture is like amplified during the in the Army, right? Because just like the fact that you feel this weakness and this doubt, like really, is contrary to what your training is. Is that correct?
Well, I think it's several factors, but you're right. And if I can just backtrack just a little bit with that, Dale, and expand upon that, I think as men, certainly of our generation and generation behind us, this idea that growing up hearing these words, don't be a crybaby, don't be a sissy, be a man. We weren't allowed to express emotions. Our role models, they hadn't learned how to express their emotions. And we squashed these emotions down to the point where we lost touch with them in many cases. In fact, there's a term for this that's been coined in the psychological literature that's called masculine alexithymia, which literally means emotions without words. And so men grew up hearing that. They didn't have role models. And that's part of the problem. And then this machismo, okay, this is what a man is. And this stigma, well, I don't want to show weakness. So already men have 2 strikes against them. And then you join an organization, a culture like the military, and now think about it. The mottos: be all you can be, army strong, one of the few, the
Be the one.
proud, the Marines.
Right.
Oh yeah, that whole idea of being tough. And so now you're asking individuals when they're struggling to admit. And although the military is changing and they're advising people, if you're struggling, go get help, there's still this stigma at certain levels, and individuals are reluctant to go get help. Albeit it's changing, and there's been some high ranking officials who have shared their story. I was depressed, or was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, or I even had suicidal thoughts, and I went and got help. So there's this culture that is changing, but still there's stigma. And so we have a ways to go. But it is changing, thank the Lord.
Well, I think it's in the very nature of the military to, to not admit emotion, because if you're in battle and you see like your best friend get taken out, then the natural reaction is denial, or just like, I'm not going to deal with my emotions because they're too painful.
Well, you can't at the time if you've got to carry on your mission.
Right.
But at some point, if you don't, it's going to catch up with you.
Right.
And like I said, I didn't deal with that trauma and that pain over the decades, and that caught up with me.
It
When
compounded.
other issues were going on, and that perfect storm that caught up with me in 2013 into 2014.
Right. So, do you have? I mean, you've been right on the front lines of this battle, but you said that the culture of the Army is changing, but you still hear that statistic that 22 veterans a day commit suicide and everything. And do you have any like ideas about what can change and what solutions can be found to? That's it's a horrifying statistic, and especially for veterans who have served their country and their families honorably and bravely, and just to have I mean, plus homelessness is another problem the veterans have. And
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, number one is connection. And when individuals leave the Army, if they are disconnected, so I talked about that camaraderie, I talked about that support, I talked about that culture, I talked about that being part of a bigger purpose. And so if a individual leaves the military, and now if they're not part of a community where they feel connected, where they feel supported, where they feel part of a bigger purpose, now things can begin to unravel. So it's important for connection. I think that's perhaps the most important thing. Are they connected? Individuals exiting service members who are in isolation is a dangerous combination. So that transition period, I think they say the first 6 months, I was trying to remember the statistic or so, there 6 to 18 months, but search can be very, very dangerous time for transitioning service members. So you began to look at protective factors, you began to look at risk factors: isolation, unemployment, lack of housing,
lack of empathy
some of
too.
their lack of health insurance, mental health issues, addictions. As you begin to pile these things on, that risk begins to rise significantly. Now, conversely, if you have an individual who is connected, an individual who does have employment, an individual who does have his health insurance, an individual who is part of something bigger than himself, an individual who, if he has mental health problems or addictions, is getting treatment. Now, these are all protective factors to help protect against
despair,
suicide. So there's this inverse U. The more protective factors you have, the lower the rates are significantly lower.
right?
The more lack of these things, the much higher the risk. And so, but that connection is so critical. And I think it goes underestimated. Financial problems would be another one. And so you can see how an individual who ends up leaving the military, separated, isolated, homeless, without economic means, just what dire straits and how high that risk can be, because these individuals also have an inordinately high number of mental health issues.
Well, one thing that I recently did a Tony Robbins program, and he was telling this story about like this Marine general who wanted him to talk to the troops and everything, and in fact they were pulled off an exercise to be able to hear Tony Robbins, and the general came up to him at the end of it and says, "Why do you think that these people who are so successful in the military, are like so degenerate or deteriorate so much once they reach civilian life?" And I think Tony Robbins said this, but he said, "Well, the problem is that you're such a high pitch of like focus and concentration on your duty when you're in the Army, that ultimately when you get out you don't have that camaraderie, you don't have that social connection, and you just like deteriorate to the level of the people you're around, and whereas when you're in the Army, the level of people you're around is so high that you benefit."
Right. And there's also structure. And leaving the Army, some of these people, it's the first time they don't have structure in their life, and that's another factor.
Okay, well, so this is a fascinating. I'm going to have you on again, Dr. Skip, because we've just barely touched the surface about things. But
it would be my pleasure, Dale. Hey, we could talk some more about wrestling. We could talk about a bunch of things, buddy.
Right. Well, as I told you yesterday, I have some experience in wrestling. I didn't like do it in high school, but I did like. Oh, very nice. Is that your veterans?
That's my national championship plaque.
Oh, congratulations. So I'm just like fascinated by this whole question of like how to like help veterans who are coming out of the Army and dealing with these issues. I mean, because to tell you the truth, I look at my own journey with schizophrenia. I said I was drafted into psychotic wars in 1975, and I've been like at the front lines of the Army of the mentally ill for like 47 years. And I had a friend who used to call me Colonel just because I feel like I was drafted as a raw recruit, and I've just moved up the ranks of the army in psychotic wars. But
I love it. Yeah.
But
you got a lot of stories, a lot of experience, and you've seen a lot of evolution in this whole field over those years, Dale.
Right. Well, I'm also very, very grateful and appreciative of the high quality of care I've gotten, even though as I said, I was in a program for 5.5 years, and I was hospitalized 9 times during that time, and for psychotic episodes. And actually, I've had like 15 hospitalizations, but the last one for an episode was in 1993. So basically, I'm 30 years out of the hospital. I did have two hospitalizations after that, but they were both like circumstantial rather than. And one was a medication problem, and one was just like a point where all my predictions were coming true, and about reality were coming true, and it just like freaked me out. But I just feel that my journey through schizophrenia has really been like a battle, and I consider myself extremely fortunate that I've come out as well as I have, but because I know so many people who didn't make it, and whether it's through death or just like being, you know, disconnected and, not there. So, I don't know what I'm really trying to say, but it's just like everybody has their issues, but you need help, and I appreciate the fact that you want to help, and you have been helping, and your switch from from service in the army to service in civilian life, and I really appreciate the fact that you do tell your story, and that's really what I'm trying to do, because I feel that the more I tell the story, the more I give hope to the families of schizophrenia, because it's like a devastating blow when someone that you love gets diagnosed with that, and it's just the the journey that I've been on has been predestined, because to bring me to this point where I can help people and give them hope.
Indeed. Indeed.
But well, I think we have about 3 minutes left. So, how would you like to summarize your observations or advice, or?
Well, let me share just a few closing remarks. I think first and foremost, if you are struggling, please, please don't suffer one more day in silence. Go get help. You owe it to yourself, you owe it to your family, and you owe it to your friends. You are valuable, and there is always hope. Never give up. No matter how bleak and how terrible it feels, don't give up. You are loved. And the other I would like to leave you with is a prescription that I have written for thousands and thousands of patients. And I tell my patients, this medication has no bad side effects, no drug to drug interactions, and you cannot overdose on this medication. Proverbs 17:22 says, a merry heart and doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit and drieth up the bones. So, all of you watching this right now live and who will watch it later, Dr. Skip's prescription for you is each and every day to take this medicine liberally and to laugh liberally. It's good medicine.
Absolutely, and that brings up the motto of my company, which is recovery is always an option. So I mean, it is you have to make the choice to want to get well. First off, you have to make the choice that you need help, and secondly, you got to make
Indeed.
the choice. You have to make the choice that you want to get well, and once you start, trying to get well, then your healthy side will become more powerful, because in a lot of cases of mental illness, the sick side or the weak side or whatever you want to say, the dark side overwhelms you, and you lose sight of your direction. But
Yep.
I really want to thank you, Dr. Skip. This has been a wonderful show. I hope people watch it, and watch it again, or watch it primarily for the first time. But it's been full of advice, and they say there's a difference between advice and opinion, and advice means counsel from someone who's been there and gone through what you want to go, whereas an opinion is just an opinion. And I appreciate the advice you've given and the openness with which you've talked about your story, and have a great day, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dale. God bless you.
Okay, well, I know what I have to say. The Mental Health Warriors are now on Spotify. So if you just want to hear the audio, and you're going to the gym or you're driving in your car, tune us in on Spotify because it's enlightening all the time, and we have a great lineup of people, and we have great interviews like this one with Dr. Skip Mondragon. So have a great one, and I look forward to seeing you again, Dr. Skip.
Thank you, Dale.
Okay, so